Scott Sloan Show on News Radio 700 WLW, of course, talking about the tragic shooting over the weekend, early Sunday morning, late Saturday night at Club Cameo. That's on Kellogg Avenue in the East End. Multiple shots fired on the dance floor, and the end result is you have 16 people struck, one fatally, the others taken to the hospital. It's become a national news story, and a national narrative continues, as this is the largest U.S. mass shooting of 2017, and keep in mind we're almost now into April with a quarter of the year over. We've had 9 mass shootings in Cincinnati. We had the worst of which 2 years ago, and I think of August, I want to say, of 2015, when 2 people, 5 injured in Madisonville at the Elks Lodge there. And now we have this story coming out this morning on News Radio 700 WLW. And I think the big question here is why? And as adults, as older adults, we think, well, why would this be a good idea that you would go in to settle, I guess, what is a dispute between parties, and it ends on a dance floor with innocent people getting shot? We'll bring in Dr. Alex Del Carmen. He's with the School of Criminal Justice at Tarleton State University in Texas. He trains police officers and agencies coast to coast on tactics and profiling, and he's on the Scott Sloan Show this morning. Dr. Del Carmen, good morning. Welcome back.
Good morning.
The big question is why. Can you put into context? Because you and I are adults. We have largely older adults listening to the show, middle-aged people going, all right, you know, here's the thing. We get into spats. We get into stupid disputes over generally women, money, territory, pride, stupid things like that. You have young people getting together and socializing. The testosterone's still in their body. How come that these things, some of these things, and sadly it seems like a lot of these things, end in violence? I mean, I guess I get if you're going to go and target an individual because they disrespected you or something stupid like that, pull out a gun and shoot them. You know, that seems like a stupid way to settle a disagreement over something that's probably trivial. But that gets escalated when you bring it into a nightclub where countless hundreds of innocent people are, and you randomly start firing at the intended subject, and obviously wind up hitting a whole bunch of people who had nothing to do with this. Could you take us? I'm sure you've studied this before. What's the mentality? Can you put it into the context?
Well, sure. I mean, part of it is when you combine age, ego, guns, violence, and everything else in one turf. I mean, the outcome is likely going to be violence at some point, and this type of violence, which doesn't really make any sense for most of us that are rational, as you indicated, adults. But at the same time, you know, you've got young people mixed in a crowd where there's alcohol, perhaps even drugs. You've got, differences of somebody pushing somebody else, and then that other person pushes a third person, and before you know it, you've got a fight. And so these are actually not very strange things that would happen in a bar, and especially this type of bar that's had a history of violence in the past. In fact, as you know, they had off-duty police officers, they had security guards, and because of the owners anticipated that this was going to happen at some point, perhaps not to this level, but that violence was going to take place. So it's not that rare to find that violence at this level will take place when you combine alcohol, perhaps even drugs, and youth all in the same room. Okay, well, here's the argument you'll hear from people like us. It's like, you know what, back in the day, back in the 90s, this place was called Annie's. It was a nightclub. It was largely a rock bar. And I wasn't around in 92. I was still in college up at Bowling Green. But we had clubs like that up there where, you know, you have rock night, dance night, whatever it is. Now, I recall many times that there were fights, there were disagreements. The bouncers would come and split the parties up. The fight may be, you know, participants thrown outside. They fight it out behind the bar. At the end of the night, you go home bruised and bloodied and battered, but you go home. What has changed culturally in the last few decades that instead of fist fights between largely guys, you now bring a gun to the dance? I think you've seen an escalation of the means in which we can engage in violence. Some people argue that we are more violent as a society. I don't necessarily agree with that. But what is real to most young people is that they have access to guns in a way they never did before. They have access to means. You know, you can go on the internet and find how to make a homemade explosive, for instance, right. Whereas in our day, that wasn't available.
Yeah, I guess that makes a lot of sense in that regard, too, and that's the terrorism aspect of it, because, I don't know, maybe is there going to be a day where we see, you know, gangbangers or wannabe gangbangers, instead of, you know, shooting each other, throwing a bomb or a homemade grenade or something on the dance floor? I shudder to think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, we criminologists often ask the question, why isn't it happening more often than what it is. And it's sort of a really sad question to ask, but the reality is when you have the motive and you have the means and you have the information and you add to that anger, youth, and inexperience, you've got a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I would anticipate that we're going to see more of these types of events throughout the United States, unfortunately, as years progress.
Dr. Alex Del Carmen, School of Criminal Justice at Tarleton State University in Texas, who trains officers and agencies on profiling tactics and the like. We're talking about the shooting at Cameo at 1:30 in the morning on Saturday here in Cincinnati, putting us again on the front page nationally. One of the other things I get, too, from people are like, well, this is why you got to close all the hip-hop clubs. I'm a fan of hip-hop. I like the little more old school than to do some of the new stuff, but I like it, generally speaking. I'm a fan of the genre. I don't look at this as a cult going, hey, it's hip-hop clubs. I hear the cries of, hey, if you have a rock bar, which they don't have anymore because rock's terrible, but country bars, for example. You don't see shootings like this in country bars. Is that a valid argument? I don't think it is. I don't necessarily think it's the style of music per se, but it's got to be the content of the character of the individuals listening to the music and enjoying the culture and thinking they have to act out the fantasies that are portrayed in those songs.
Yeah, I would actually argue that it's not about the bar per se. It's about the type of access that people have to those bars, meaning that if you've had, and I'm not blaming the owner, I'm not putting blame on anyone, but the reality is if you've had incidents of violence before, it stands to reason that not only do you put police officers, as he apparently did, but you also put metal detectors. You do things that would allow for individuals not to have guns inside a bar when there's alcohol involved.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's not a matter of what type of bar to close, as opposed to how are you going to give access to that bar to people, and are you really going to allow people with guns inside a facility such as that one where alcohol is going to be consumed. Kind
of a sad state and a sad indictment. Back in the day when I would go to the clubs, when I was much, much younger, I've never walked through a metal detector before, but to get in some of these bars, you have to. That's a sad indictment of our society.
It is a sad indictment, but at the same time, we've got to get over it as Americans. And I tell you what, if you look at Israel, they've got the right mindset when it comes to having those metal detectors and, as we call, capable guardians at the entrance of malls and movie theaters. Because if we're going to be a safe society, if we don't want these things to happen all over the place, we've got to step up our game in terms of security and safety protocols to make sure that those individuals that are borderline and going to pull out a gun and shoot us are not allowed to enter those premises with a gun.
Dr. Alex Del Carmen on the show on News Radio 700 WLW, and that's the thing. And how do you prevent further tragedies from happening? I pointed out we've gone through this exercise so many times, and people always complain about something having changed, something having to give. Do you think that by and large, though, Americans would tolerate metal detectors and high levels of security? You mentioned Israel. I had a friend go over there recently, came back and said it's incredible. You go into a restaurant there, you pay your tax, the VAT tax, whatever. There's actually a line on the receipt. You pay with Visa, whatever, right? On the receipt, there's actually a security tax that's on there, too, because they have to have an armed guard. They have to have somebody, checking IDs or whatever. And just to go into a restaurant there, it's incredible.
Absolutely. And, at some point in our society, as you noted, we have evolved. We have evolved not only in technology, not only in social media, but we've also evolved in the means in which we can hurt other people. And at the end of the day, the United States has many enemies within and outside of the U.S. that innocent people are going to continue to perish if we don't step up our game in terms of designing a safety protocol that we Americans can digest and finally understand that the old 1952 United States is no longer a society with different enemies, with different realities, and we've got to be able to safeguard children and the innocent bystanders that are going to continue to die at the hands of irresponsible people.
Doctor, you pointed out, too, at the beginning, I agree, there's a perception that America is more dangerous than any other time in history, and you just mentioned the 1950s, and I go, yeah, well, we have all images of Father Knows Best, and, you turn on MeTV and Leave It to Beavers on, and there's Ward Cleaver mowing his lawn with his suit on, and, there's no breaking and entering, there's nothing like that, but, the 1950s, you still could lynch people in America America with impunity. You could still beat your wife with impunity or your kids. You could do a lot of things that are criminalized today. So I would contend that maybe because of news and 24/7 news cycle and this stuff is intensified and we see it, if a shooting happened in 1952 in Cincinnati, Ohio, generally in Illinois you wouldn't be hearing about it too much. It wouldn't be big news because you didn't have the 24/7 electronic news cycle. So I think that I would agree. I think today it's certainly not the wild, wild west like it used to be, and even back to the genteel, seemingly 1950s, the old days weren't always that good.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And from the perspective of crime, I think that we have improved our ways. For instance, we now report domestic violence. We now report sexual assaults in your own home, whereas in the 1940s and 50s, that was not in the norm, and it would have never been prosecuted as a crime. Having said that, today we have not only the means in which to report crime more often, but we also, if you really look back in the past 4 or 5 years, we now also have perhaps a greater capacity in which to inflict crime on other people. So these types of attacks that we saw, in Cincinnati, we saw, last week in London, and various other things, they're going to continue because people have the means in which to inflict harm on others that they never did back in the day. And so I would argue that you're right in the sense that we've gotten better in some ways, but we've also improved our potential of having massive people get hurt in a single instance because of the access to things that we have now that we never did before.
Yeah. Mass shootings in general, if you look at the history of the United States, I don't know how far back they track this, and you heard mixed reviews that, for a long time, despite the work of gun activists, the rate of mass shootings, the odds of you getting shot in mass shooting are relatively extremely low and still are. But have we seen an uptick in the last number of years when it comes to mass shootings, or is that just the media and the hyper reporting that's going on?
Yeah, so I think we've seen a little bit of both. So the media seems to now emphasize the mass shootings because there's always that suspicion that it's going to be a terrorist attack. If you look at what came out of Cincinnati 48 hours ago, one of the first statements that was perhaps the most important statement that people wanted to hear was, A, how many people were killed, and B, was it a terrorist attack? Mm-hmm. And so at the end of the day, what we're really in tune for almost immediately is it terrorism? And so there seems to be, if you want to call it, a call to fame for anyone that attacks anyone else. And the worst thing about that is that we have copycats around the nation. I would not be surprised if, in the next few days, sadly, we find that other incidents similar to Cincinnati's take place in the United States from people they just want to have those 2 seconds of glory in the news because of the fact of what they learned that happened 48 hours ago. So there's some of that as well that's going on across the U.S.
That's an interesting point on terrorism. You're right. The first thing is, okay, where was it? How many people were shot? And was it an act of terror? But I would contend for the people in that nightclub on Kellogg Avenue, did it really matter if it was a jihadi or it was a gangbanger or it was a lunatic with a gun? It really didn't matter. It was terrorism, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, anytime you inflict terror on other people, obviously, and you inflict, damage, not only of property, but also the loss of life, to those families that are grieving today, there's no question that was terror 101. Having said that, for the rest of us, in terms of being able to understand the type of damage and potential of damage to other parts of the U.S., and whether or not this is a coordinated attack or whether or not we're being attacked on our homeland, it does carry serious implications, obviously.
Yeah, I suppose in this case, although Omar Mateen goes into a gay nightclub, not many people, as a percentage of population, are going to go in a nightclub, let alone a gay one. So, but again, I mean, look at the reaction the rest of America had as a result of that, because it was foreign terrorism instead of what I would call domestic in nature, and that's exactly what this is. Dr. Alex Del Carmen at Tarleton State University in Texas. Thanks for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.